What if I told you the birthplace of Western civilization was not one nation at all, but a patchwork of fragile city-states, forever at war with each other? A people who painted dolphins on palace walls, but also whispered of a monster hidden in the dark. Half man, half bull, the Minotaur. Was it a myth or a memory of rituals too dark to record? Then came the Mycenaeans, not dreamers, warriors. They buried their kings in tombs of gold and sailed across the sea to fight the most famous war in history. The cause? A woman, Helen of Sparta, the face that launched 1,000 ships, and the city of Troy burned. But was it real, or just a story sung in firelit halls? Archaeologists found ashes, walls torn down, a city destroyed. Maybe Homer's song was true, and then everything collapsed. The palaces fell. Writing was forgotten. Greece itself vanished into centuries of silence. No kings, no armies, no memory. But even in the dark, the stories survived. Achilles' wrath, Hector's courage, Odysseus' long journey home. They became lifelines. They became Greece. And from those ashes, something greater emerged. Athens, Sparta, democracy, philosophy, the clash with the Persian Empire, the dream of freedom against the might of kings. This is the story of gods and men, of freedom and empire, of brilliance and downfall, a story that still shapes the world we live in. So if you think you know ancient Greece, think again, because what begins as myth will end in empire, and the lessons Greece left behind, they're not ancient at all. They're ours. Subscribe if you haven't already, and get comfortable, because this is the story of Greece, and it's not what you think.
I say we drench the gods with their blood! What say you, Spartans? For our sons! For our daughters! For Sparta!
The Aegean Sea, a restless sheet of blue, islands rising from the water like jagged stones left by the gods themselves. Here, in these scattered lands, the story of Greece begins. It is not born in silence. It is born in fire, in myths, and in blood. Before there were philosophers, before democracy, before empires, there were kings, palaces, and legends that blurred the line between history and dream. Far south, on the island of Crete, a civilization rose. The Minoans. They were not warriors. They were builders, dreamers, masters of the sea. At Knossos, their capital, palaces stretched across the earth like labyrinths of stone. Corridors painted with crimson frescoes. Walls alive with bulls, dolphins, and dancers leaping through the air. This was not a kingdom of iron spears. It was a kingdom of trade, of color, of ritual. Their ships crossed the Mediterranean. Their merchants brought wealth. Their priests brought fear of gods both merciful and cruel. But Crete gave something else to the world. A story. They spoke of a king named Minos, of a beast locked in the dark. Half man, half bull. The Minotaur. Some say it was myth. Others say it was memory twisted into legend. Perhaps it was only the echo of rituals. Youths thrown into labyrinths, bulls sacrificed in blood. But the story spread, and with it, the idea that Greece itself was born in mystery. The Minoans seemed unshakable, but nothing lasts forever. Around 1450 BCE, fire and ruin struck Crete. Palaces burned. Knossos fell. Some say it was an earthquake. Others point to invaders from the north. The sea swallowed their strength. and so the first great Greek dream ended. But from its ashes, a harder world arose. Across the mainland, new rulers carved their names into stone. The Mycenaeans. They were not dancers. They were not dreamers. They were warriors. High citadels rose above rocky hills. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylus, fortresses crowned with walls so massive that later Greeks said only giants could have built them. Cyclopean walls. Their kings ruled from Megaron's halls of power and fire. They lived for conquest. They buried their dead in tombs of gold. Masks of hammered metal pressed against the faces of their rulers, as if to preserve their eternal glory. This was a world of blood feuds, of raiding ships, of men who carried bronze swords and boasted of their kills. It was here that the seeds of Greek legend were sown, because the Mycenaeans did not just fight among themselves. They set their eyes on the greatest prize of all. On the far shore of the Aegean, across the narrow strait, stood the city of Troy, commanded the passage between seas, controlled trade routes. It was wealthy, powerful, and in the memory of Greece, it became the setting for the greatest war of the ancient world. The cause? A woman, Helen, Queen of Sparta, the most beautiful mortal ever born. Stolen or seduced by Paris, Prince of Troy, her abduction ignited a fire. The kings of Greece swore an oath to sail east, to bring her back, to burn Troy to the ground. What followed was not only war, it was legend. At the gates of Troy fought Achilles, the swiftest of all men, almost invincible, yet doomed to die young. Beside him stood Ajax, towering and unshaken. Odysseus, cunning and restless, his mind sharper than any blade. And against them the princes of Troy, Hector, noble and doomed, carrying the weight of his city on his shoulders. Priam, the old king, pleading for peace as the world collapsed around him. For 10 years, the Greeks battered Troy. For 10 years, the Trojans endured. Until one night, a trick of shadows ended it all. A wooden horse rolled through the gates. A gift, they thought, but within its hollow belly warriors hid. And when darkness fell, Troy burned. The walls crumbled. The towers collapsed. The screams of a city swallowed the night. Was it history, or was it myth? Archaeologists have found ruins at Hazarlik, fires, destruction, echoes of war. Perhaps Troy fell around 1200 BCE. Perhaps not as Homer sang it, but in some form the city truly died in fire. But for Greece it did not matter, because from that moment on the war lived forever. A memory passed in song, an epic carved into the soul of a people. When the Mycenaean kings returned, they found only ruin. Their palaces burned, their people scattered. The age of citadels ended. The world slipped into darkness. The Greece of warriors and gold collapsed. But the stories endured. In firelit halls, bards recited the epics. The wrath of Achilles, the fall of Hector, the grief of Priam. The world of Minoans and Mycenaeans was gone. But in its place, a new Greece was waiting. Not one of kings and tombs, but one of stories. Stories that shaped gods, heroes, and a people who would never forget. The dawn had broken. Civilization had risen. Civilization had fallen. Now the land lay quiet. A dark age loomed. The songs of Homer would keep memory alive. But Greece itself stood on the edge of silence. This was only the beginning, because from the ruins of Troy, from the ashes of Mycenae, a new world was waiting to be born. The palaces were burning. Great stone walls, once thought unshakable, now crumbled beneath fire and sword. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylus. One by one, the citadels of the Aegean collapsed. No one knows why. Some whisper of foreign invaders. Others blame famine, earthquakes, or the anger of the gods. But what is certain is that the proud Mycenaean world vanished almost overnight. The gold masks were buried, the kings were slain, the sea routes went silent. For centuries, the Aegean had been alive with trade ships carrying bronze, wine, and olive oil across the waves. Now the waters were empty, the harbors rotted, the smith's fire went cold. A silence spread, not just of trade, but of memory itself. Because something greater was lost. Writing, the linear B tablets, the language of kings and scribes, disappeared. The Mycenaeans had recorded their world in symbols scratched into clay. Now no one could write, no one could read. Knowledge, once held in the hands of palaces, was gone. The Greeks fell into amnesia. Villages shrank into shadows of their former selves, isolated, suspicious, cut off from one another. Iron replaced bronze, not because of progress, but because bronze was gone. Trade was dead. The connections that bound the Aegean world together were severed. And for nearly 400 years, Greece disappeared from history. People without cities, without kings, without memory. Yet even in the silence, something endured. The bards, around hearth fires and in lonely villages, singers remembered. They carried the past not in stone, not in tablets, but in words. Stories passed from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation. Tales of a great war at Troy, of heroes and their rage, of gods who loved and hated like men. A blind poet gave it form, Homer, or someone like him. He sang of Achilles, who burned with fury, of Hector, who died defending his city, of Odysseus, who wandered seas for 10 long years, longing only for home. These songs were more than memory. They were lifelines. In the darkness of the age, the Greeks clung to them. They gave shape to a world that had fallen apart. They kept alive the idea of heroism, of honor, of a people who still mattered. This was the gift of the Dark Age. Even when cities lay in ruins, even when writing itself was lost, the voice of Greece did not fall silent. It survived in the rhythm of verse, in the pounding of words like footsteps in the night, in the memory of Troy, burning forever. For 100 years passed. When Greece reemerged with new cities, new laws, new vision, it was these stories that gave them their foundation. They would look back to the heroes of Troy, to the wrath of Achilles, to the cunning of Odysseus, to a world that may never have been, yet shaped everything that was to come. The Dark Age was not just an age of forgetting. It was the birth of memory itself. Even in the ruins, the Greeks found a way to live forever. The silence was ending. Villages would grow into city-states. A new world was coming, one built not on palaces or kings, but on the power of the people. The long night of the Dark Age slowly lifted. Across the Greek lands, small villages had clung to survival through centuries of isolation. Life was simple, fragile, and local. Farmers tended small plots. Shepherds moved their flocks across the hills. Families gathered around hearths, repeating old stories passed down by memory. But gradually, change began. The people of Greece started to gather together in larger communities. Hilltops, once chosen for safety, became centers of life. Stone walls rose. Marketplaces appeared. Temples were built to honor the gods. Out of scattered villages, something new emerged. The polis, the city-state. The polis was more than a town. It was a community, bound not just by stone walls, but by a shared sense of identity. A polis was its people, its land, its gods, its laws. It was both a physical place and a way of life. Each polis was fiercely independent, proud of its own traditions. Yet together, these city-states gave Greece its unique shape. Among the earliest, 3 names would shine: Athens, resting beside the sea, grew from a cluster of villages into a thriving port. As people turned to trade, sailing across the Aegean, bringing back grain, pottery, and ideas. Sparta, hidden inland in the valley of the Eurotas River, developed differently. Fertile land surrounded it, and early Spartans conquered their neighbors, binding them into service. A society of warriors began to take form. Corinth, lying on the narrow isthmus that linked northern and southern Greece, became a gateway. Its harbors opened to both east and west. Merchants and craftsmen flourished, making Corinth rich and well-connected. No single city ruled them all. Each polis stood alone, self-governing, self-defending, proud of its autonomy. Yet they shared a common language, common gods, and common festivals. Across the hills and islands, Greeks began to feel both separate and united, a patchwork of independent communities tied by culture. This rise of the polis marked a turning point. The age of scattered villages was over. The age of the city-state had begun. From these city-states would come wars and rivalries, but also art, philosophy, and the first experiments in democracy. Out of the ruins of the Dark Age, order was forming. Out of chaos, identity was being forged. The Greeks had found a new home. Not an empire, not a kingdom, but the polis, small, proud, and enduring. As the new city-states grew, their people faced an old problem. The land of Greece was beautiful, but it was also limited. Rugged mountains cut the country into narrow valleys. Soil was thin. Fields could not feed everyone. Families multiplied. Villages expanded. Yet harvests stayed the same. Soon, many polis found themselves with more mouths than grain. Hunger threatened. The solution lay not within the hills of Greece, but beyond the horizon. And so the Greeks turned to the sea. Ships set sail from crowded harbors. Small wooden vessels carried farmers, merchants, and families across the Aegean, the Ionian, and far beyond. They followed the stars at night, hugging the coasts by day. Wherever they landed, they founded new settlements, colonies that stretched like stepping stones across the Mediterranean world. To the east, they built homes along the coast of Asia Minor. To the north, they reached the Black Sea, founding towns where wheat fields stretched wide and rivers carried trade inland. To the west, they sailed to southern Italy and Sicily, places so filled with Greek life that the region came to be called Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. These colonies were not ruled as distant provinces. Each remained tied to its mother city by tradition, religion, and kinship. They sent back grain, metals, and timber. They received in return pottery, wine, and olive oil. Trade grew, ideas traveled, and the Greek world expanded far beyond its rocky homeland. In Sicily, colonies clashed with the Carthaginians, powerful traders from North Africa. In Italy, they brushed against the Etruscans and, later, the rising power of Rome. Along the Black Sea, they met the nomads of the steppes. Each encounter brought both danger and opportunity. Colonization changed Greece itself. With new wealth flowing in, merchants rose in importance. Markets grew busier. Coinage began to appear, making trade easier. Contact with distant lands brought fresh skills, new gods, and strange stories. Slowly, the Greeks became not only farmers and warriors, but sailors, traders, and storytellers of a wider world. The colonies also spread the idea of the polis. Wherever Greeks settled, they built temples, marketplaces, and councils. They carried with them their love of independence, their pride in self-rule. Even on foreign shores, the Greek spirit of community endured. By the 6th century BCE, the Mediterranean glittered with Greek colonies like stars scattered across the night. The sea, once a barrier, had become their bridge. The polis was no longer just a local home. It was a global identity, stretching from Spain to the Black Sea. Among all the Greek city-states, none would shine as brightly as Athens. At first, Athens was like the others, a community of farmers and warriors, ruled by kings, then by aristocrats. Power lay in the hands of the few. Wealthy families controlled the land. Poor farmers struggled, often falling into debt. Some were forced into slavery. Tension grew. Athens was rich in trade, rich in ideas, but poor in peace. The city needed change. The Athenians turned to law. They sought order not through the sword, but through written rules. Around 621 BCE, they asked a man named Draco to set down the city's first code. His laws were strict, so strict that even minor crimes could mean death. Harsh as they were, the laws marked a turning point. For the first time, rules were public, not secret. Justice could be known, not guessed. But the harshness of Draco could not calm the people. Another reformer rose, Solon, a wise poet and statesman. Around 594 BCE, Solon reshaped Athenian life. He canceled debts that crushed the poor. He ended debt slavery. He opened politics to more citizens, giving voice not just to the wealthy but also to merchants, craftsmen, and farmers. Solon's reforms did not end conflict, but they planted seeds. Seeds of fairness. Seeds of participation. As decades passed, Athens experimented further. Tyrants came and went, some cruel, some kind. Yet the city continued to grow in trade, in wealth, in confidence. By the late 6th century BCE, another leader, Cleisthenes, took a bold step. He reorganized Athens into new tribes, breaking the old power of noble families. He created councils chosen by lot, where ordinary citizens could serve. It was the beginning of something the world had rarely seen before: democracy. In Athens, every citizen, though only free men were counted, could speak in the assembly. They could vote on laws. They could decide on war or peace. Leaders were not kings but men chosen by the people, accountable to the people. The system was imperfect, limited, often messy. Yet it was revolutionary. Power was no longer a gift of birth. It became, at least in part, the voice of the many. In the shadow of the Acropolis, democracy was born, not fully grown, not flawless, but alive. From Athens, this idea would one day travel far beyond Greece, carried across centuries, across empires, into the very heart of modern life. Athens had turned conflict into law, law into reform, reform into democracy. Out of disorder, it had crafted a new vision of community, one that would echo through history. If Athens was the city of words, Sparta was the city of steel. Where Athens built democracy, Sparta built discipline. Where Athenians debated in the assembly, Spartans trained in silence. Sparta lay in the southern land of Laconia, surrounded by fertile valleys. Yet the Spartans did not turn to trade or art. They turned to war. From an early time, they conquered their neighbors, the Mycenaeans, and forced them to work the land as helots, a population bound to serve. To keep control, Sparta became a fortress in itself. Life in Sparta was unlike life anywhere else in Greece. From birth, a Spartan child belonged not just to family but to the state. Weak infants were often abandoned, for only the strong could serve the city. Boys were taken from their mothers at the age of 7 and placed into the agoge, a rigorous system of training. Here they learned endurance, hunger, obedience. They marched barefoot. They slept on reeds. They trained in combat, in wrestling, in discipline. They were taught few words, but strong ones. In Sparta, silence was strength. A Spartan was expected to return from battle only with his shield or upon it. Girls, too, lived differently than elsewhere in Greece. Spartan women were trained in athletics, encouraged to be strong so they might bear strong children. They managed estates since men were often away at war. Compared to the women of Athens, They lived with more freedom, more voice, more power. The government of Sparta was unique. It had two kings ruling side by side, one for war, one for order. A council of elders gave wisdom. An assembly of citizens approved decisions. Yet at its heart, Sparta was an oligarchy. Rule by the few, shaped by discipline, guarded by fear. Sparta did not build monuments like Athens. It left behind few temples, few words, little art. Instead, it built warriors. This greatness lay not in beauty but in strength. To allies, Sparta was a shield. To enemies, it was terror. And yet, even Sparta's might was fragile. Its system depended on keeping the helots subdued, always watching, always ready. Behind the armor of unity lay the constant fear of rebellion. Still, for centuries, Sparta endured. It carved its place not with marble or music, but with discipline, obedience, and war. If Athens dreamed of freedom, Sparta lived for control. If Athens raised voices in debate, Sparta raised spears in silence. Together, these two opposites, so different, so divided, would one day face the same storm. The world was changing. Far to the east, beyond the seas and the deserts, beyond the mountains and the rivers, there had risen a power unlike any that Greece had ever known. It was called the Persian Empire. To the Greeks, it seemed almost endless. To the world, it was the master of lands and peoples beyond counting. The Persians were not merely another kingdom. They were something larger, something vast. Founded by Cyrus the Great, the empire stretched farther than any before it. From the mountains of India to the valleys of Egypt, from the burning sands of Arabia to the frozen plains near the Black Sea, all paid tribute to Persia. Cyrus had begun it. His son Cambyses had carried it further. And then came Darius, the king who ruled with precision and order, binding together a world under his throne. Roads stretched across continents. Messengers sped with royal commands. Armies gathered from every corner of the earth. Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Scythians, Phoenicians, all bound beneath the Persian crown. It was a realm of wealth and power. Gold flowed in from conquered lands. Cities glittered with palaces and gardens. Great halls rose in Persepolis and Susa, where kings sat on thrones of stone, gazing out at their empire of millions. And yet, one small place remained outside their grasp. Greece, a land broken into city-states, a land where no single ruler commanded all, a land where arguments filled the assemblies, where rivalries turned city against city, and where wars broke out over borders, trade, and pride. To Persia, it must have seemed a minor place, a stubborn corner of the earth that should be brought to heel as all others had been. But the Greeks were different. They had no king who spoke for all. They had no empire to defend. What they had was freedom, messy, quarrelsome, fragile, but fiercely guarded. And it was this freedom that now collided with the will of the Persian kings. The spark came not in Greece itself, but across the sea, in the cities of Ionia on the coast of Asia Minor. These Greek cities, though far from the mainland, shared language, gods, and traditions with their Western kin. But they lived under Persian rule. When they rebelled, burning the city of Sardis and defying the great king, Athens sent aid. It was a small gesture, but it lit a fire of anger in Darius. How dare these distant, insignificant people raise their hands against him? From that moment, Greece was no longer a remote corner of the world. It was an enemy. Darius raised his hand and gave an order. A servant was commanded, every day at his table, to speak the same words. "Master, remember the Athenians." The invasion began. Persian ships gathered. Soldiers crossed seas. The empire had decided to make an example of Greece. And yet, here the story takes its first unexpected turn. For when the Persian armies landed on Greek soil, they met not a people ready to bow, but a people ready to fight. Farmers became soldiers. Hoplites stood in their bronze armor, shields locked, spears forward. Against all odds, they won. This was the Battle of Marathon, a single clash on a coastal plain where the greatest empire in the world was turned back by a handful of city-states. The Persians would return, of course. Darius died before he could strike again, but his son Xerxes took up the task. 10 years later, his armies would march once more, greater than before, to crush Greece once and for all. But in that first encounter, the shadow of Persia fell across the Greek world. It was not only a battle of soldiers, it was a battle of ideas. Empire against freedom, tyranny against self-rule, the many against the few. In the halls of Athens, in the training fields of Sparta, in the harbors of Corinth, the Greeks knew that their world was in danger. They had seen the storm arrive. They had felt the edge of its power, and they knew with certainty that it would come again. The shadow of Persia had stretched across the Aegean Sea. It would not be lifted easily. It would not be forgotten. And so Greece prepared, waiting for the return of the empire that ruled the world. The mountains of Greece rose like stone walls. Sharp ridges cut the sky. Valleys narrowed into hidden passes. One of these passes would become a place of legend, Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. It was here, in the year 480 BCE, that a small band of Greeks stood against the greatest army the world had ever seen. The Persian king Xerxes had returned. His father, Darius, had fallen short at Marathon. Now the son brought vengeance. His forces poured into Greece like a flood. Vast, uncountable. Some say 2 million men. More likely hundreds of thousands. Still, to the tiny cities of Greece, the difference hardly mattered. Persia was endless. Greece was small. The Persians marched with cavalry, with archers, with armored infantry from every corner of the empire. Indians with cotton tunics. Egyptians with tall shields. Scythian horsemen with bows. All under the banner of the great king. Against them stood the fragile alliance of Greece. Athens, Sparta, and a scattering of smaller cities. No single polis could stand alone. But together, perhaps, they could buy time. The plan was simple. Hold the Persians at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a place where mountains crushed against the sea, so tight that only a few men could fight at once. If the Persians could not break through here, Greece might yet survive. And so Leonidas, king of Sparta, marched north. With him, 300 of his chosen warriors. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were the heart of Sparta's warrior society, raised from childhood to endure pain, hunger, and death without fear. They were joined by allies, perhaps 7,000 Greeks in all. Men from Thespi, Thebes, and other cities who refused to bow. The battle began with waves of Persians. They rushed into the pass expecting an easy victory. But the Greeks fought as one. Shield pressed to shield. Spears braced forward. The Persians broke upon them like water against stone. Again and again they came. Medes, Scythians, warriors from the east. All hurled into the narrow throat of the Hot Gates. All cut down. Then Xerxes sent his elite, the Immortals, 10,000 strong. Men who were said never to die, for whenever one fell, another rose to take his place. But even the Immortals faltered in the pass. Their numbers counted for nothing in the choking narrow way. The Spartans and their allies fought with grim discipline, driving them back. For 2 days, the Greeks held the line. The Persians lost thousands. Xerxes watched in fury. But betrayal came. A local man, seeking reward, revealed a secret path through the mountains, a way to outflank the Greeks. Xerxes seized the chance. He sent his troops around the pass. And soon, Leonidas learned the truth. His army would be surrounded. The Greek allies panicked. Many withdrew, hoping to fight another day. But Leonidas stayed, with his 300 Spartans, with 700 Thespians who refused to leave, and a small band of Thebans pressed into the defense. They would not retreat. They would not surrender. The last stand began. The Spartans fought with broken spears, with swords, with bare hands. They fought until their armor was shattered, until their bodies gave way. King Leonidas fell. Around him, his men stood until the very end. It was slaughter, but not defeat, for their sacrifice bought time. Time for Athens to evacuate its people. Time for the Greek navy to prepare at Salamis. Time for Greece to rally once more. Thermopylae became more than a battle. It became a symbol, a few holding against many, freedom standing against tyranny, courage blazing in the face of certain death. And though the Persians marched on, though Athens itself would soon burn, the memory of Leonidas and his 300 lived on. It told every Greek that even the might of Persia could be resisted, that even the smallest city could stand tall if its heart was strong. And in that spirit, Greece endured. The Persians had returned. 10 years after Marathon, the world's greatest empire sent its might once again across the Aegean. This time, King Xerxes himself led the invasion. His armies were so vast that ancient storytellers spoke of rivers drunk dry and bridges of boats stretched across seas. Whether exaggerated or not, the scale was unlike anything Greece had ever faced. The cities of Greece, often divided and hostile to one another, understood the danger. They quarreled as they always did. Yet in the end, they agreed to stand together. To hold the invader at bay, they needed a place where numbers mattered less, where courage and terrain could make the difference. That place was Thermopylae. Thermopylae means the hot gates. It was a narrow pass, hemmed in by steep mountains on one side and the sea on the other. At its narrowest point, only a handful of men could fight abreast. To the Greeks, it seemed the perfect bottleneck. And to guard it, they chose their bravest. King Leonidas of Sparta led a small force, just 300 Spartans, accompanied by several thousand allies from other Greek cities. Why so few? Because Sparta was observing a religious festival, and its laws forbade the full army from marching until the rites were complete. Leonidas chose his men carefully, only those with living sons, so that no family would be left without an heir. The Persian host soon arrived. The sheer size must have been terrifying. Yet Leonidas and his men did not yield. When Xerxes demanded that they lay down their arms, the Spartans sent back a reply, "Come and take them." For 2 days, the Greeks held the pass. The Persians hurled wave after wave against the defenders. Their numbers counted for nothing in the narrow confines of the hot gates. Greek shields locked together, spears thrust forward, and the invaders fell in heaps. Even Xerxes' elite guard, the Immortals, were repelled. The courage of the Spartans and their allies stunned the Persians. Against impossible odds, the Greeks stood firm. But betrayal would change everything. A local Greek, seeking favor from Xerxes, revealed a hidden mountain path that bypassed the pass. Persian troops marched through the night and outflanked the defenders. Leonidas knew what this meant. The battle was lost. He dismissed most of the Greek army, ordering them to retreat and fight another day. But he and his Spartans remained, along with a small band of Thespians and Thebans who chose to share their fate. At dawn, they fought their last stand, surrounded, battered, and outnumbered beyond count. The Spartans fought with broken spears, with swords, even with their bare hands. One by one, they fell. Leonidas himself died in the press of battle. The Persians finally broke through, but at a terrible cost. The stand at Thermopylae had delayed their advance and inspired all of Greece. The memory of those few days would echo through history. Though Thermopylae was, in truth, a defeat, it was also a symbol. A handful of men, standing against the might of an empire, had shown that courage and sacrifice could defy overwhelming power. The Persians now surged deeper into Greece. Athens would burn, its temples consumed by fire. Yet the spirit of resistance, fanned by Thermopylae, would not die. The Greeks had seen what was possible. They had seen men choose freedom over life itself. The hot gates became more than a battleground. They became a legend, and that legend would help rally Greece for what came next, the clash upon the sea at Salamis. The sea was quiet in the dawn light. Its surface shimmered like polished bronze. Beneath the calm, an empire prepared for war. The Persian navy stretched across the horizon, hundreds upon hundreds of ships. They were sleek triremes, painted with the colors of distant provinces. Egypt, Phoenicia, Cilicia, all had sent vessels at the command of the great King Xerxes. It was the largest fleet the world had ever seen. Against it stood the Greeks, barely 300 ships drawn mostly from Athens. Their prows were sturdy, but few compared to the Persian multitude. And yet this was their last hope. The Greek alliance had been driven to the brink. Thermopylae had fallen. Athens itself lay in ashes, its temples smoking on the Acropolis. Families had fled across the sea. Despair hung heavy. But Themistocles, the Athenian statesman, saw what others did not. The Persians were too many to fight on open water. But in the narrow straits near the island of Salamis, numbers meant nothing. He spread whispers. He sent messages that reached the Persians themselves. He wanted Xerxes to believe the Greeks were breaking apart, that some were ready to betray the alliance. Xerxes listened. The trap was set. At dawn, the Persian fleet surged into the straits. They expected an easy victory, but the waters betrayed them. The channels narrowed. The long wings of the fleet had no room to spread. The oars of one ship tangled with another. The great fleet began to stumble over itself. And that was when the Greeks struck. From the shadows of Salamis, the triremes lunged forward. Their bronze rams glinted like blades. They struck the Persian hulls with thunderous cracks. Greek rowers pulled in perfect rhythm. Soldiers on deck shouted hymns to their gods. Athenians and Corinthians, Aeginetans and Megarians, together they fought as one. Themistocles' strategy was working. The Persians, crowded in confusion, could not maneuver. Their larger numbers became a burden. The sea itself seemed to turn against them. The battle raged all morning. Persian ships splintered, their decks washed with seawater and blood. The cries of men drowned beneath the crash of wood and bronze. Some Persian captains fought fiercely. Phoenician mariners held their ground. But the tide would not change. Artemisia of Caria, one of Xerxes' commanders, made a daring escape, ramming a Persian ally to clear her path. Even in chaos, her cunning impressed the great king watching from the shore. But no act of courage could save the fleet. One by one, the proud ships went down. From the cliffs above, Xerxes looked on. He had built bridges of boats to cross the sea. He had carved a throne into the hillside to witness his victory. But instead, he saw ruin. The fleet of the great king was breaking apart, undone by the cunning of a smaller foe. The dream of crushing Greece at sea was over. As the sun set, the straits were choked with wreckage. Masts snapped. Oars drifted like bones in the tide. Survivors clung to shattered planks, their voices fading with the evening. The Greeks gathered, weary but triumphant. They had stood against the largest navy the world had known, and won. The victory at Salamis was more than a battle. It was survival itself. The Persians still had armies in Greece. But without control of the sea, they could not feed them. They could not outflank the defenders. They could not hold what they had taken. For the first time, the tide of the war had turned. The tiny city-states of Greece had done the impossible. Not through size, not through strength, but through unity, courage, and cunning. On that evening, the Greek sailors raised their voices. Hymns echoed across the straits. The gods had favored them. And freedom, fragile, uncertain, precious, had lived another day. Salamis was not the end, but it was the beginning of victory. The war was not yet over. Though the Persian navy had been shattered at Salamis, Xerxes still commanded the largest empire the world had ever known. His armies stretched across continents. His resources seemed endless. And though the great king himself returned to Asia, leaving behind his half-defeated forces, he was not finished with Greece. A vast Persian army still lingered in the land, commanded by the general Mardonius. Unlike the fleeting strikes of ships, this was an army that dug itself into the soil, that fed on the fields, that threatened to stay until Greece bent the knee. If the Greeks could not drive it out, all their sacrifices, the ships sunk, the cities burned, the lives lost, would mean nothing. The Persians settled in central Greece, counting on allies to join them. But here, the tide of the war turned again. The memory of Salamis, the defiance at Thermopylae, the miracle at Marathon. All of it had ignited a new unity. City-states that once bickered came together. For once, Athens and Sparta, Corinth and Megara, Thebes and others, found themselves bound by the same cause. It was here, in the summer of 479 BCE, on the rolling plains near the town of Plataea, that the final confrontation approached. The Persian camp stretched wide, rich with tents and cavalry. They held the advantage of numbers as they always had. But the Greeks, though fewer, were hardened by years of fighting. They carried with them not just shields and spears, but the memory of all they had endured. The armies faced one another, hesitant to strike first. For days they stared across the fields. Skirmishes erupted, but the great battle did not come. The Persians waited, confident that hunger and fear would weaken their enemies. The Greeks endured, each city's men standing together, bound in fragile alliance. At last, the fighting could be delayed no longer. The Greeks advanced in their phalanxes, shields overlapping, spears bristling. Against them charged the Persians, swift and fierce, with cavalry sweeping across the plain. The clash was thunderous. Bronze struck iron, spears shattered, arrows darkened the air, and yet the line held. The Greeks fought as a wall of men, each shield protecting the man beside him. Discipline carried the day. Spartan soldiers pressed forward, unyielding, their king Pausanias commanding. The Persians tried to break the line, but the wall would not crack. Slowly, steadily, the Greeks pushed them back. Panic spread in the enemy ranks. Then Mardonius himself fell, struck down amid the chaos. With his death, Persian confidence collapsed. The once mighty army dissolved into flight, leaving the plain littered with the fallen. The Greeks had won. Plataea was not just another victory. It was the end of the invasion. With the Persian army shattered, their threat in Greece was finished. The world's greatest empire had been turned back by the smallest of nations. The battles of this war, Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, were more than moments in time. They were legends in the making. They spoke of courage against impossible odds, of freedom defended at the cost of lives, of unity forged in the face of annihilation. And so, with the fields of Plataea silent at last, Greece stood free. Its people were exhausted, its cities scarred, but its spirit unbroken. The age of survival was over. A new age was about to begin, one in which Greece would no longer only defend itself, but rise to shape the world. The smoke of the Persian Wars still lingered in memory. Cities lay ruined. Temples had been burned. But Athens had survived. And from the ashes it dreamed. At the heart of that dream stood one man, Pericles. He was not a king. Athens did not allow kings anymore. He was not a tyrant. Athens had learned to fear tyrants. Instead, he was something different, a leader chosen again and again by the people themselves. Pericles believed Athens was destined for greatness, not just in battle, not just in power, but in spirit. He looked at the rocky hill rising above the city, the Acropolis. Once temples to Athena had stood there. Now they were rubble toppled by Persian fire. Pericles promised they would rise again, greater than before, worthy of the goddess of wisdom. Stone by stone, vision became reality. The Parthenon began to rise. Columns gleamed white against the blue sky. Marble carried from distant quarries, shaped with skill, lifted into place. It was not just a temple. It was a statement. Athens had been small, vulnerable, but now it stood as the beating heart of Greece. The Parthenon was its crown. Inside, sculptors carved a towering statue of Athena, plated in gold and ivory. Her spear pointed to the heavens. Her shield guarded the city. She was more than a goddess. She was Athens itself. Pericles' vision did not stop with temples. He poured wealth into theaters, into festivals, into art and learning. He opened the city to thinkers, writers, and builders. He called Athens the School of Hellas, a place where the human spirit could reach its highest form. Democracy, too, deepened under his hand. Citizens gathered in the assembly. They voted, argued, debated. They ruled themselves. Not perfectly, slaves and women were excluded. But compared to the kingdoms and empires of the world, Athens was something astonishing. A city of free men, a a city of voices, a city of ideas. Visitors came from across Greece and from far beyond. They walked the streets and saw marble rising, theaters filling, citizens speaking their minds. They saw a city alive with energy, and they carried its stories back home. For a moment, it seemed as if nothing was impossible, that Athens had found the secret of lasting greatness, that here on this rocky peninsula human genius had found its highest form. But Pericles knew, even as he built, that all human things are fragile. Stone can crumble, democracy can falter, dreams can fade, and yet he pressed on, because in his time, in his Athens, the dream was alive. As the city glittered with marble and echoed with festivals, another kind of building began, not of stone but of thought. Athens was a city of words. In the assembly, citizens debated laws. In the marketplace, traders shouted prices. But in the shadows of temples, in the shade of olive trees, a new voice began to rise. It belonged to Socrates. He was not handsome. He wore no fine robes. He walked barefoot through the dusty streets. He asked questions, simple questions but heavy ones. What is justice? What is courage? What is the good life? Most men thought they knew the answers. Socrates asked again and again, until certainty slipped away. He did not write. He did not lecture in great halls. He spoke in the agora, the marketplace of Athens. He stopped craftsmen, soldiers, and politicians. He listened. He probed. He unsettled. Some grew angry. Some laughed. Some began to wonder. To Socrates, wisdom was not knowing many things. It was knowing how little one truly knew. Athens called itself the school of Greece, but Socrates made Athens its classroom. Every street corner became a place of philosophy. Every conversation, a chance to search for truth. His method was simple yet profound. He never gave answers. He asked, and through the asking, he forced others to think. Among the young, he gained followers. Among the powerful, he made enemies. Because questions are dangerous. Questions can unseat certainty. Questions can shake the foundations of a city. And Athens, for all its confidence, had foundations that could crack. War loomed. Rivalries sharpened. The dream of Pericles was bright, but beneath it shadows lengthened. Still, Socrates walked the streets. He spoke to whoever would listen. He taught no doctrine, founded no school. Yet his spirit spread. It would outlive marble, outlast kings. His students would carry his questions into the future. Plato, who would write dialogues that still speak today. Aristotle, who would shape centuries of thought. Through them, through words and questions, Socrates would never truly die. In his time, though, he was only a man with a wrinkled face, a sharp tongue, and a restless mind. A man who believed that wisdom began not in answers, but in doubt. And so Athens shone with two lights, one of marble and festivals, the dream of Pericles, and one of questions and searching, the voice of Socrates. Together they made Athens not only a city of power, but a city of the mind. At the foot of the Acropolis, where the sacred rock met the open air, Athens built a stage. It was not small. It was vast, carved into the hillside, a great semicircle of stone seats rising like waves. Here, beneath the gaze of the gods, the people of Athens gathered. This was the theater of Dionysus, place for stories, place for voices, a place where the city came together, citizens, foreigners, and even slaves, to watch the drama of life unfold. The plays were not mere entertainment. They were lessons. They were mirrors. They asked the same questions as Socrates, but in the language of poetry and song. In spring, during the festival of Dionysus, the city paused. Work ceased. The marketplace grew quiet. all eyes turned to the theater. Here came the great writers: Aeschylus, who gave weight to tragedy; Sophocles, who shaped tales of fate and choice; Euripides, who showed the struggles of ordinary men and women; Aristophanes, who laughed at politicians and mocked the powerful. Each year, new plays were performed: 3 tragedies and a comedy, stories of gods and kings, heroes and fools, sorrows and joys. Masks hid the faces of actors, yet revealed the emotions of the characters. Choruses sang, their voices rising and falling like the sea. Music filled the air. The people listened, sometimes weeping, sometimes laughing, always thinking. The tragedies spoke of fate, of hubris, of the cost of pride. They reminded Athenians that even the greatest could fall, that even kings must answer to justice. The comedies spoke of politics, of war, of the quirks of daily life. They reminded Athenians that power could be mocked, that laughter was also wisdom. In the theater, the city examined itself, its strengths, its flaws, its dreams, its fears. To sit in the theater of Dionysus was to feel part of something larger. It was to see the stories of the past, the struggles of the present, and the questions of the future, woven together on a single stage. The stones of the theater still remain today, silent, weathered. But in the age of Pericles, those stones carried voices that shook the city. Athens was more than walls and ships, more than silver and spears. It was a place of words, a place of thought, a place of stories. And in the shadow of the Acropolis, where gods and men seemed to meet, the theater of Dionysus gave Athens a soul. In the sunlight of Athens, stone was shaped into life. Marble, cold and unyielding, was given breath by the hands of sculptors. The Greeks sought beauty, but not a fleeting beauty. They sought harmony, balance, and proportion, a beauty that seemed eternal. Walk through the city of Pericles, and you would see statues everywhere. Gods, heroes, athletes, their bodies carved with care, their faces calm, their forms perfect yet human. It was not enough to show power. It was not enough to show wealth. The sculptors of Athens searched for something deeper, an ideal, the human form perfected, strength without arrogance, grace without weakness. The most famous of them was Phidias. His hands shaped visions of the divine. He worked on the Parthenon, filling it with statues of gods and warriors. His greatest masterpiece was Athena herself, towering within the temple, a statue of gold and ivory, her spear raised high, her shield gleaming in the light of the flames. To the Athenians, art was not decoration. It was devotion. It was philosophy in stone. It was a way of showing the order of the universe. Even the smallest details mattered. The folds of a robe, the curve of a smile, the tension of a muscle before it moved. Each figure seemed caught between stillness and motion, frozen at the perfect moment. Painters too worked their craft, though their colors have long since faded. They painted vases with scenes of gods and men, of battles and banquets, of music, love, and play. Black figures on red clay, red figures on black, simple yet filled with life. In these works, Athenians saw themselves, not only as they were, but as they wished to be: brave, noble, balanced, eternal. Beauty to them was not vanity. It was order. It was symmetry. It was the language of the cosmos, translated into stone and clay. To stand before a statue in Athens was to be reminded of what humanity could become. Not just the strength of warriors, not just the wisdom of philosophers, but the harmony of body and spirit. And so the city gleamed. temples crowned with sculpture, marketplaces filled with art, homes adorned with painted vessels. Athens was not only a place of war, not only a place of debate, it was a place of beauty, a city that believed art was as essential as bread, as necessary as law, as lasting as stone. The marble may now be broken, the colors faded, the statues worn by time, but in the age of Pericles, Athens stood as a gallery beneath the sky, a vision of beauty carved into the very heart of the city. The Golden Age of Athens was bright, but brightness is delicate. Like a flower in full bloom, could not last forever. The city stood proud under Pericles. Its temples gleamed, its theaters sang, its markets bustled with life. Yet beneath the beauty, there were shadows. Power attracts envy. Wealth invites rivalry. Athens was not alone in Greece. Other cities watched with wary eyes. Sparta, strong and disciplined. Corinth, wealthy and ambitious. The smaller polis, each guarding their independence. Athens led the Delian League, a league of allies meant to resist Persia. First, it was a shield, but over time, Athens made it into something more. The league became an empire. The allies paid tribute. The tribute filled Athenian treasuries. And from that treasury came marble, came ships, came the greatness of the city. But resentment grew. Athens was admired, but also feared. Its allies whispered of chains. Its rivals spoke of arrogance. Within Athens, too, there were cracks. Democracy gave freedom, but freedom gave rise to quarrels. Speakers in the assembly argued. Factions clashed. Citizens were swayed by voices that promised much, but delivered little. The arts and ideas of Athens flourished, but so did pride. And pride is dangerous. It blinds, tempts. It makes a city believe it cannot fall. Pericles himself saw the danger. He spoke often of moderation. He urged his people to be cautious, to protect what they had built. But even he could not stop the tide. The flower had bloomed too brightly. Its petals, delicate and fragile, were already beginning to fade. War with Sparta loomed on the horizon. The Peloponnesian War, a storm that would test Athens, as never before. But for now, in the time of Pericles, the city still glowed, still sang, still believed in its own greatness. Perhaps that is what made it beautiful. Not its temples, not its statues, not even its philosophers, but its brief, dazzling confidence. A belief that humanity could rise higher, could build something greater, could make the world more beautiful. A fragile flower, blooming in the rocky soil of Greece, delicate, yet unforgettable. Its petals have long since fallen, but the memory of its beauty remains. Athens in the Golden Age, brilliant, shining, fragile. The smoke of the Persian Wars still lingered in memory. Cities lay ruined. Temples had been burned. But Athens had survived. And from the ashes it dreamed. At the heart of that dream stood one man, Pericles. He was not a king. Athens did not allow kings anymore. He was not a tyrant. Athens had learned to fear tyrants. Instead, he was something different, a leader chosen again and again by the people themselves. Pericles believed Athens was destined for greatness, not just in battle, not just in power, but in spirit. He looked at the rocky hill rising above the city, the Acropolis. Once temples to Athena had stood there. Now they were rubble toppled by Persian fire. Pericles promised they would rise again, greater than before, worthy of the goddess of wisdom. Stone by stone, vision became reality. The Parthenon began to rise. Columns gleamed white against the blue sky. Marble carried from distant quarries, shaped with skill, lifted into place. It was not just a temple. It was a statement. Athens had been small, vulnerable, but now it stood as the beating heart of Greece. The Parthenon was its crown. Inside, sculptors carved a towering statue of Athena, plated in gold and ivory. Her spear pointed to the heavens. Her shield guarded the city. She was more than a goddess. She was Athens itself. Pericles' vision did not stop with temples. He poured wealth into theaters, into festivals, into art and learning. He opened the city to thinkers, writers, and builders. He called Athens the School of Hellas, a place where the human spirit could reach its highest form. Democracy, too, deepened under his hand. Citizens gathered in the assembly. They voted, argued, debated. They ruled themselves. Not perfectly, slaves and women were excluded. But compared to the kingdoms and empires of the world, Athens was something astonishing. A city of free men, a city of voices, a city of ideas. Visitors came from across Greece and from far beyond. They walked the streets and saw marble rising, theaters filling, citizens speaking their minds. They saw a city alive with energy, and they carried its stories back home. For a moment, it seemed as if nothing was impossible, that Athens had found the secret of lasting greatness, that here on this rocky peninsula, human genius had found its highest form. But Pericles knew, even as he built, that all human things are fragile. Stone can crumble, democracy can falter, dreams can fade, and yet he pressed on. Because in his time, in his Athens, the dream was alive. As the city glittered with marble and echoed with festivals, another kind of building began, not of stone but of thought. Athens was a city of words. In the assembly, citizens debated laws. In the marketplace, traders shouted prices. But in the shadows of temples, in the shade of olive trees, a new voice began to rise. It belonged to Socrates. He was not handsome. He wore no fine robes. He walked barefoot through the dusty streets. He asked questions, simple questions but heavy ones. What is justice? What is courage? What is the good life? Most men thought they knew the answers. Socrates asked again and again, until certainty slipped away. He did not write. He did not lecture in great halls. He spoke in the agora, the marketplace of Athens. He stopped craftsmen, soldiers, and politicians. He listened. He probed. He unsettled. Some grew angry. Some laughed. Some began to wonder. To Socrates, wisdom was not knowing many things. It was knowing how little one truly knew. Athens called itself the school of Greece, but Socrates made Athens its classroom. Every street corner became a place of philosophy. Every conversation, a chance to search for truth. His method was simple yet profound. He never gave answers. He asked, and through the asking, he forced others to think. Among the young, he gained followers. Among the powerful, he made enemies. Because questions are dangerous. Questions can unseat certainty. Questions can shake the foundations of a city. And Athens, for all its confidence, had foundations that could crack. Were loomed. Rivalries sharpened. The dream of Pericles was bright, but beneath it shadows lengthened. Still, Socrates walked the streets. He spoke to whoever would listen. He taught no doctrine, founded no school. Yet his spirit spread. It would outlive marble, outlast kings. His students would carry his questions into the future. Plato, who would write dialogues that still speak today. Aristotle, who would shape centuries of thought. Through them, through words and questions, Socrates would never truly die. In his time, though, he was only a man with a wrinkled face, a sharp tongue, and a restless mind. A man who believed that wisdom began not in answers, but in doubt. And so Athens shone with two lights. one of marble and festivals, the dream of Pericles, and one of questions and searching, the voice of Socrates. Together they made Athens not only a city of power, but a city of the mind. At the foot of the Acropolis, where the sacred rock met the open air, Athens built a stage. It was not small, it was vast, carved into the hillside, a great semicircle of stone seats rising like waves. Here, beneath the gaze of the gods, the people of Athens gathered. This was the theater of Dionysus, place for stories, place for voices, a place where the city came together, citizens, foreigners, and even slaves, to watch the drama of life unfold. The plays were not mere entertainment. They were lessons. They were mirrors. They asked the same questions as Socrates, but in the language of poetry and song. In spring, during the festival of Dionysus, the city paused, work ceased, the marketplace grew quiet, all eyes turned to the theater. Here came the great writers, Aeschylus, who gave weight to tragedy, Sophocles, who shaped tales of fate and choice, Euripides, who showed the struggles of ordinary men and women, Aristophanes, who laughed at politicians and mocked the powerful. Each year, new plays were performed, 3 tragedies and a comedy, stories of gods and kings, heroes and fools, sorrows and joys. Masks hid the faces of actors, yet revealed the emotions of the characters. Choruses sang, their voices rising and falling like the sea. Music filled the air. The people listened, sometimes weeping, sometimes laughing, always thinking. The tragedies spoke of fate, of hubris, of the cost of pride. They reminded Athenians that even the greatest could fall, that even kings must answer to justice. The comedies spoke of politics, of war, of the quirks of daily life. They reminded Athenians that power could be mocked, that laughter was also wisdom. In the theater, the city examined itself, its strengths, its flaws, its dreams, its fears. To sit in the theater of Dionysus was to feel part of something larger. It was to see the stories of the past, the struggles of the present, and the questions of the future, woven together on a single stage. The stones of the theater still remain today, silent, weathered, but in the age of Pericles, those stones carried voices that shook the city. Athens was more than walls and ships, more than silver and spears. It was a place of words, a place of thought, a place of stories. And in the shadow of the Acropolis, where gods and men seemed to meet, the theater of Dionysus gave Athens a soul. In the sunlight of Athens, stone was shaped into life. Marble, cold and unyielding, was given breath by the hands of sculptors. The Greeks sought beauty, but not a fleeting beauty. They sought harmony, balance, and proportion, a beauty that seemed eternal. Walk through the city of Pericles, and you would see statues everywhere. God's heroes, athletes, their bodies carved with care, their faces calm, their forms perfect yet human. It was not enough to show power. It was not enough to show wealth. The sculptors of Athens searched for something deeper, an ideal, the human form perfected, strength without arrogance, grace without weakness. The most famous of them was Phidias. His hands shaped visions of the divine. He worked on the Parthenon, filling it with statues of gods and warriors. His greatest masterpiece was Athena herself, towering within the temple, a statue of gold and ivory, her spear raised high, her shield gleaming in the light of the flames. To the Athenians, art was not decoration. It was devotion. It was philosophy in stone. It was a way of showing the order of the universe. Even the smallest details mattered. The folds of a robe, the curve of a smile, the tension of a muscle before it moved. Each figure seemed caught between stillness and motion, frozen at the perfect moment. Painters too worked their craft, though their colors have long since faded. They painted vases with scenes of gods and men, of battles and banquets, of music, love, and play. Black figures on red clay, red figures on black, simple yet filled with life. In these works, Athenians saw themselves, not only as they were, but as they wished to be: brave, noble, balanced, eternal. Beauty to them was not vanity. It was order. It was symmetry. It was the language of the cosmos, translated into stone and clay. To stand before a statue in Athens was to be reminded of what humanity could become. Not just the strength of warriors, not just the wisdom of philosophers, but the harmony of body and spirit. And so the city gleamed, temples crowned with sculpture, marketplaces filled with art, homes adorned with painted vessels. Athens was not only a place of war, not only a place of debate, it was a place of beauty, a city that believed art was as essential as bread, as necessary as law, as lasting as stone. The marble may now be broken, the colors faded, the statues worn by time, but in the age of Pericles, Athens stood as a gallery beneath the sky, a vision of beauty carved into the very heart of the city. The Golden Age of Athens was bright, but brightness is delicate. Like a flower in full bloom, could not last forever. The city stood proud under Pericles. Its temples gleamed, its theaters sang, its markets bustled with life. Yet beneath the beauty, there were shadows. Power attracts envy. Wealth invites rivalry. Athens was not alone in Greece. Other cities watched with wary eyes. Sparta, strong and disciplined. Corinth, wealthy and ambitious. The smaller polis, each guarding their independence. Athens led the Delian League, a league of allies meant to resist Persia. First, it was a shield, but over time, Athens made it into something more. The league became an empire. The allies paid tribute. The tribute filled Athenian treasuries. And from that treasury came marble, came ships, came the greatness of the city. But resentment grew. Athens was admired, but also feared. Its allies whispered of chains. Its rivals spoke of arrogance. Within Athens, too, there were cracks. Democracy gave freedom, but freedom gave rise to quarrels. Speakers in the assembly argued. Factions clashed. Citizens were swayed by voices that promised much, but delivered little. The arts and ideas of Athens flourished, but so did pride. And pride is dangerous. It blinds, tempts. It makes a city believe it cannot fall. Pericles himself saw the danger. He spoke often of moderation. He urged his people to be cautious, to protect what they had built. But even he could not stop the tide. The flower had bloomed too brightly. Its petals, delicate and fragile, were already beginning to fade. War with Sparta loomed on the horizon. The Peloponnesian War, a storm that would test Athens, as never before. But for now, in the time of Pericles, the city still glowed, still sang, still believed in its own greatness. Perhaps that is what made it beautiful. Not its temples, not its statues, not even its philosophers, but its brief, dazzling confidence. A belief that humanity could rise higher, could build something greater, could make the world more beautiful. A fragile flower, blooming in the rocky soil of Greece, delicate, yet unforgettable. Its petals have long since fallen, but the memory of its beauty remains. Athens in the Golden Age, brilliant, shining, fragile. The world of Greece was tired. The city-states that had once stood as proud beacons of independence were now worn down by centuries of rivalry and war. Athens, once the shining jewel of democracy, had been humbled. Sparta, fierce and unyielding, had lost its strength. The Peloponnesian War had drained the land, leaving bitterness, broken alliances, and the memory of endless battles. In the north, beyond the mountains, lay Macedon. For generations, it had been regarded as a lesser kingdom, half Greek, half foreign. The great cities of the south looked at it with disdain. They saw it as rough, rustic, unrefined. A land of tribes and farmers, not philosophers and statesmen. Yet from this overlooked kingdom would come a force strong enough to change the fate of Greece. From its hills and plains, from its kings and warriors, a new order would rise. And at its heart stood one man, Philip II of Macedon. Philip's youth was not spent in idle comfort. As a boy, he was sent as a hostage to Thebes, one of the most powerful cities of Greece. There he lived among his people's rivals, but he was not simply a prisoner. He observed, he learned, he studied the tactics of Theban generals. He watched the politics of Greek city life. What might have been a period of humiliation became, instead, a school for kingship. When Philip returned to Macedon, he brought with him ideas that would transform his kingdom. The land he inherited was fragile, surrounded by enemies. Its army was weak, its borders insecure. But Philip saw opportunity. His first task was to reform the army. He armed his soldiers with a new weapon, the sarissa, a pike far longer than the traditional spear. In the hands of disciplined men, these long spears created a wall of iron points, a formation nearly impossible to break. The Macedonian phalanx was born. But Philip did not stop at weapons. He trained his men relentlessly. He rewarded loyalty, punished disobedience, and drilled his army until it moved as a single body. What had once been a band of poorly organized warriors became a machine of war. Step by step, Philip secured his kingdom. He defeated rival tribes. He brought rebellious nobles under control. He strengthened his borders, fortified his rule, and made Macedon into a power that could no longer be ignored. As his power grew, Philip turned his gaze southward, toward Greece itself. The city-states, weakened by their endless rivalries, were vulnerable. Philip advanced slowly, carefully, always with a mix of diplomacy and war. He offered alliances to some, crushed resistance in others. His armies swept through Thessaly, Thrace, and beyond. But the true test came in 338 BCE at the Battle of Kyrenia. There, Philip faced the combined might of Athens and Thebes. The great powers of Greece had set aside their quarrels for one last stand. It was a moment that felt decisive, an echo of the old unity, one final attempt to resist the rising tide. The battle was fierce. Spears clashed, shields pressed. The phalanxes ground against one another in the dust of the plain. And then victory. Philip's army broke the lines of the Greeks. The pride of Athens was shattered. The sacred band of Thebes, that elite company of warriors bound by love and oath, was cut down almost to the last man. The independence of Greece was ended. After Kyrenia, Philip called the Greek states to assembly. He did not destroy them. Instead, he offered them a place in a new order, an alliance known as the League of Corinth. On the surface, it was a league of equals united under common cause. In truth, it was Macedonian dominance made permanent. Philip now looked east beyond the Aegean Sea to the Persian Empire. For over a century, Persia had loomed as a giant presence, sometimes invading Greece, sometimes clashing with its cities. Now, Philip dreamed of leading the Greeks in a great campaign against that old enemy. For once, Greece would not fight itself, it would fight together against a common foe. The preparations began. Armies were raised. Plans were made. A new age seemed ready to dawn. But fate is often cruel to those who plan too far ahead. In 336 BCE, Philip attended a festival at Aegae, the old capital of Macedon. There, in the midst of celebration, surrounded by nobles and guards, the king was struck down, assassinated, cut down not on the battlefield, but in the very moment of triumph. The details remain uncertain. Was it the act of a personal enemy? The result of palace intrigue? A plot from abroad? History has never agreed, but the result was clear. Philip II was dead. For a moment, the future of Macedon trembled. The king who had built its power was gone. The armies were strong, but without leadership, even the greatest armies falter. The Greek cities watched closely, waiting for a chance to break free. And into this storm stepped a youth, Philip's son, Alexander. He was only 20 years old, young, unproven, prince now suddenly a king. At first there were doubts. Could one so young hold together the empire his father had built? Would the generals obey him? Would the cities remain loyal? The tests came swiftly. Rebellions rose in the north. Thebes, bold and defiant, declared its independence. But Alexander moved with a speed that startled friend and foe alike. He struck down his enemies with relentless force. The northern tribes were subdued. Thebes was crushed, its walls torn down, its people sold into slavery. The message was clear. Macedon's rule would not be challenged. Greece fell silent once more, and in that silence, Alexander stood, no longer the uncertain boy, but the undisputed master of Macedon and Greece. The chapter closes not with conquest fulfilled, but with conquest promised. Philip had dreamed of Persia. Alexander now inherited that dream. Behind him lay a Greece exhausted by centuries of strife. Before him stretched an empire vast beyond imagination. From the ashes of Greece, a conqueror had risen, and the world was about to change. By the time the army was ready, Macedon stood united. Greece was pacified, and the path to Persia lay open. Alexander gazed at the horizon, where the sun touched the distant lands of Asia. The journey would be long, the battles would be brutal, but already, even before the first march east, the seeds of legend had been sown. He would lead not as a boy king, but as a force of destiny. The world had yet to see the scale of what was coming, and from this quiet dawn in Macedon, history itself began to tremble. The armies of Macedon marched east. Dust rose in long, swirling clouds beneath the wheels of wagons and the hooves of horses. The air was thick with anticipation, with fear, with the unspoken knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. Alexander rode at the front, young, resolute, a shadow of destiny in human form. His eyes scanned the horizon, imagining the lands beyond, the rivers, the deserts, the mountains of Persia. Each step forward was not merely a march, it was a declaration. The Macedonian king had come, and history would bear witness. The first test came at the Battle of the Granicus River. Persian forces awaited him, a mixture of infantry and cavalry, thousands in number. The river's waters ran red as spears clashed, as soldiers screamed and fell. Alexander led from the front, charging into the thick of battle with his companions by his side. His presence was magnetic, terrifying, inspiring. The Macedonian phalanx pressed forward, their long sarissas forming a wall of iron and wood. Persian cavalry tried to flank them, but Alexander anticipated each movement, countering with precision. By nightfall, the river was crossed, the Persians routed. Victory came at a cost, but it came, and Alexander's legend began to grow. already whispered among his soldiers as unstoppable, almost godlike. Next, the army pressed into Asia Minor through cities and rugged terrain. Each conquered city became a foothold. Each victory was a lesson. Alexander did not merely fight. He imposed order, secured loyalty, and left a vision of governance behind him. Then came Issus, where Darius III himself commanded the Persian forces. The battlefield was narrow, hemmed by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. It seemed impossible that Alexander's smaller army could prevail. Yet he moved with clarity, with instinct, with that relentless audacity that defined him. He struck at the center. He pierced the heart of the Persian line. Darius fled, leaving his army to falter. Alexander pursued him, yet allowed the king to escape. Part strategy, part calculation, part showmanship. Every move enhanced his reputation, not just as a commander, but as a figure destined to shape the world. The Macedonian army advanced relentlessly, city after city falling under their control. Yet Alexander did not merely conquer through force. He sought legitimacy. He allowed local rulers to maintain some authority, provided they acknowledged his sovereignty. He respected temples, honored customs, and merged Greek and local practices. In this way, he became more than a conqueror. He became a bridge between worlds. At Gaugamela, the decisive battle loomed. The Persian army outnumbered Alexander's forces, stretching across the plain like a living sea. Chariots, cavalry, infantry, thousands of men ready to overwhelm. But Alexander's vision was flawless. He arrayed his forces with genius, anticipating every possible threat. The battle erupted. Spears clashed. Shields shattered. The earth trembled beneath the hooves of cavalry. Alexander rode forward into the chaos, cutting a path through enemy lines. Darius fled once more, leaving the empire vulnerable. Victory was total, absolute, undeniable. By the end of the campaign, the Persian heartland lay open to Macedon. Alexander had conquered not just cities, but imagination. He had defeated a world-spanning empire that had once seemed invincible. The young king was no longer merely Alexander of Macedon. He was Alexander the Great, and yet the campaign was far from over. Beyond the deserts and rivers of Persia, beyond Babylon and the mountains of the east, lay new lands, new challenges, new horizons. Alexander's journey was just beginning. The world had been opened to him, and he would not rest until every corner of it felt the weight of his ambition. The sun rose over the eastern Mediterranean, spilling gold across the Nile Delta. Alexander's army had marched relentlessly, crossing deserts, rivers, and mountains. The Persian heartland had fallen, yet still lay ahead the lands of Egypt, an ancient civilization older than memory, a land of gods, pharaohs, and eternal monuments. Egypt welcomed him, not with armies, but with awe. The people, weary of Persian rule, saw in Alexander a liberator. Temples opened their gates. Priests hailed him as a chosen one. And in the city of Memphis, the heart of the kingdom, Alexander was crowned pharaoh. It was more than a title. It was a declaration of unity, a symbol that he would not merely conquer, but also rule with respect to the traditions of the land. He walked among the temples, observing hieroglyphs that told stories older than any man alive. He listened to the priests, absorbing wisdom that spanned centuries. The weight of Egypt's history settled upon him, not as a burden, but as a mantle of destiny. Alexander's vision extended beyond Egypt's borders. He looked to the Nile, to the coast, to the horizon. He would leave a mark that time itself could not erase. And so he founded Alexandria. On the shores of the Mediterranean, he chose the site carefully, a harbor that could welcome ships from every corner of the known world, a city that would be a beacon of Hellenic culture, learning, and commerce. Its streets would carry the languages of traders and scholars alike. Its libraries would house knowledge from Athens, Babylon, and Egypt. Alexander did not see it merely as a settlement. He saw it as a symbol, a testament to what a single vision, paired with ambition, could create. The Egyptian campaign was not just conquest. It was diplomacy, ritual, and spectacle. Alexander moved through the cities, honoring the gods, paying tribute to local rulers, and presenting himself as both warrior and king. The people responded with reverence. Priests whispered that he was chosen by Ammonius, the god of kingship, linking Alexander to the divine. For the first time in his life, the young king saw the power of perception, how myth could shape reality, how a ruler could become legend in the eyes of his subjects. Yet Alexander did not linger. The Persian Empire still stretched far to the east. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis awaited him. The sands of Mesopotamia called for his army, for his strategy, for the boldness that had become his signature. Egypt was a jewel in his crown, but it was only one jewel. He could see the road ahead, stretching through deserts and mountains, to lands that few Greeks had ever imagined. In the evenings, he walked along the Nile banks. He watched the sun dip beneath the horizon, turning the water to molten gold. He listened to the whispers of his officers, of the priests, of the soldiers who spoke of destiny, of glory, of immortality. He knew that every step forward carried risk. The further he pushed, the greater the challenge. But risk was no deterrent. It was the measure of greatness. In Egypt, he planted the seeds of legacy. Alexandria would endure long after armies faded. Temples and tombs would remember him. Even as his eyes turned eastward, he left behind a city that would become a symbol of his vision. A city of light, learning, and power. Alexander had crossed a threshold. From the dusty plains of Macedon to the ancient Nile, he had proven that a single mortal could wield influence that touched the divine. Egypt bowed before him, yet he did not rest. The empire he had inherited from Philip was now in his hands. And Persia, the heart of the ancient world, awaited. The world was watching, and Alexander, young, relentless, and unyielding, was ready to step into history. Beyond the deserts of Persia, beyond the rivers that had carved the empire, lay lands that few Greeks had ever imagined. Mountains rose like jagged teeth, rivers roared with unfamiliar power, and forests stretched thick and green, hiding dangers from the eyes of men. Alexander pressed forward. He would not turn back. The horizon called to him, and he answered with steel, determination, and vision. The armies moved cautiously, yet boldly. Every step eastward was a challenge, new terrain, new peoples, new tactics. Alexander knew that to conquer, one must understand not only armies, but the land itself. He studied maps, questioned locals, and scouted relentlessly. Even in the unknown, he saw strategy, opportunity, and the chance to cement legend. At the Hydaspes River, a great confrontation awaited. King Porus, a ruler as brave as any Alexander had faced, commanded elephants and soldiers trained to face even the fiercest invader. The battlefield shimmered under the sun. The elephants moved like living mountains, trunks swinging, tusks flashing, eyes wild. Soldiers clutched their spears and shields, hearts pounding. Alexander rode forward, fearless, calculating, almost untouchable in his resolve. He studied the enemy lines, tested their strength, and struck at the moment when vulnerability appeared. His cavalry outflanked the elephants. His phalanx pressed forward relentlessly. The riverbanks ran red with blood, the earth scarred by war. Porus fought with courage that matched Alexander's own. But even the mightiest defenses cannot withstand relentless strategy and iron discipline. When the battle ended, Porus remained alive, captured not as a defeated enemy to be humiliated, but as a ruler worthy of respect. Alexander reinstated him as a satrap, ensuring loyalty and order in the newly conquered land. This was not mere conquest, it was governance, the art of ruling as well as fighting. Yet even as victory was celebrated, challenges mounted. The army had marched farther than any Greek had dared. The rivers were strange, the jungles thick and suffocating. The monsoon rains turned paths into mud, slowed the cavalry, and tested the patience of soldiers. They were men who had followed Alexander across continents, through deserts, plains, and rivers. They had fought and conquered. They had endured the impossible. But now they began to hesitate. They whispered of home. They muttered about exhaustion. Even the bravest hearts faltered. At the Hyphasis River, the limit of human endurance became clear. The soldiers refused to march further into unknown lands. The promise of glory was outweighed by the fear of the unknown. Alexander did not openly argue. He understood their fear. He gave in not as a defeat but as a measure of wisdom. The march east would end here. Still, the campaign into India left a mark that would never fade. Alexander had faced elephants, rivers, and lands that seemed designed to resist him. He had overcome all, with brilliance, courage, and relentless determination. The men who returned with him were hardened, tested beyond anything they had known. Yet Alexander's vision did not diminish. He had crossed continents, reshaped kingdoms, and seen the edge of the known world. His name would travel faster than armies. Stories of the battles, the courage, and the audacity would ripple across lands far beyond Macedon. As he gazed toward the west, toward the lands he had already conquered, Alexander knew that the next challenge awaited. Babylon, the heart of Persia, promised wealth, power, and a center from which his empire could truly rule. But first, the men needed rest, the lands needed order, and Alexander himself needed to consolidate what had been achieved. The journey east had been perilous, yet it had forged legends, and in every soldier's heart, the name Alexander carried weight beyond mortality, for he was no longer merely a king of Macedon. He was the master of lands, of men, and of destiny itself. The east had been tested, and Alexander had triumphed. The march west began quietly. Rivers, mountains, and jungles had tested Alexander and his army, and the men were weary. Yet there was no rest in triumph, only preparation. Babylon awaited, a city of immense wealth, ancient power, and promises of immortality. The army crossed the deserts with discipline, each step measured, each supply caravan guarded. Alexander rode among his men, silent, reflective, yet unyielding. He had conquered Persia, tamed Egypt, and braved the lands of India. Yet the empire's heart remained to be secured. Babylon rose on the horizon like a dream. Its walls were immense. Its canals glimmered beneath the sun. Its temples reached for the heavens. To Alexander, it was both a jewel and a throne. He entered the city with ceremony befitting a king of kings. Priests bowed. Citizens watched in awe. Markets hummed with life. Palaces, long the seat of Persian kings, now fell under Macedon's gaze. Alexander was not content merely to conquer. He sought to unite. He enacted reforms. He married women of Persian nobility. He integrated Macedonians and Persians in his armies. The empire would not be ruled by fear alone. It would be bound by vision, law, and the semblance of unity. Plans for the future were vast. New cities, trade routes, and further campaigns were already drawn on maps. Alexander dreamed of the edges of the world, of lands unknown even to his generals. He envisioned an empire that stretched from Greece to the Indus and beyond. Yet the mortal frame, however relentless, has limits. Fever came quietly at first, a subtle weakness in the chest, a pallor to his face. The armies, accustomed to his invincibility, began to notice hesitation. Doctors, magi, and priests attended him, offering remedies and prayers. But the fire that had carried him across continents could not escape the body's vulnerability. Days passed. Alexander's strength waned. He summoned his generals and spoke of plans that would never come to be, boundaries that would never be crossed, ideas that would live only in memory. He named successors in hope that the empire might endure, though he would not. The city of Babylon held its breath. The streets, alive with celebration and commerce, now watched a king decline. The boy who had become a legend, who had shattered empires and faced gods in mortal form, lay on a bed of fine linens, pale, weakened, yet undimmed in spirit. When the end came, it was silent. No trumpets heralded his passing. No armies marched in mourning. Yet in the hearts of men, a force of nature had vanished. Alexander, 32 years old, had lived like a god, yet died as a man. The world felt smaller after him. Cities would rise and fall. Empires would crumble. But his legend would remain. Stories of his courage, audacity, and brilliance would ripple across continents, inspiring generations of warriors, kings, and dreamers. Even in death, Alexander shaped history. Babylon would be remembered not only as a city of wealth, but as the stage for the final act of a man who had touched the infinite. His vision, his ambition, and his myth would endure far beyond the limits of his body. From the sands of Macedon to the banks of the Nile, through the jungles of India, and into the heart of Persia, the name Alexander became more than a man. It became destiny. It became legend. It became a story that time itself could not forget. The empire he left behind was vast, fractured, and mortal. But the spirit of Alexander, the audacity to dream beyond what the world deemed possible, was immortal. And from Babylon, history whispered his name. The death of Alexander left a silence across the known world. Babylon, once alive with the footsteps of a conqueror, now held only whispers of ambition and echoes of a dream. Soldiers and generals alike paused, uncertain of what to do with the empire that stretched farther than any mortal mind could comprehend. It was vast Egypt, Persia, Mesopotamia, India, vast but leaderless, vast but fragile. And in this vacuum, men of ambition saw opportunity. Alexander's generals, the Diadochi, looked at one another across the councils of the dying king. Each possessed loyalty, cunning, and courage, but ambition was their true inheritance. The empire would not remain whole, could not. Ptolemy took Egypt, a land of eternal deserts and the Nile's abundant gift. Seleucus claimed Persia, stretching his hand over Mesopotamia and the heart of Alexander's eastern conquests. Antigonus and Lysimachus seized parts of Asia Minor and Thrace. Cassander ruled Macedon and Greece. The Diadochi carved kingdoms with the precision of surgeons. Yet even as they fought for borders and titles, they inherited Alexander's vision, the fusion of Greek and local cultures. The Hellenistic world would not be Macedon, nor Athens, nor Sparta. It would be something entirely new, Greek in thought, Persian in territory, Egyptian in splendor, Indian in ambition. This was not merely politics. It was transformation. Alexander had conquered men, but these generals would conquer ideas. Greek culture across continents. Alexandria rose on the Mediterranean, a jewel of intellect and ambition. Its harbor teemed with ships from every corner of the known world. Its streets rang with languages, Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and beyond. The Library of Alexandria became the heart of inquiry, a place where knowledge from every culture was collected, cataloged, and debated. In science, men like Archimedes explored the laws of motion and leverage. Mathematicians like Euclid created the frameworks that would define geometry for centuries. Philosophers, Stoics and Epicureans, pondered virtue, happiness, and the human condition. The world became a laboratory for thought, a stage where curiosity replaced conquest as the ultimate pursuit. Greek language became the lingua franca, carrying ideas across deserts, mountains, and seas. Trade routes, once veins of commerce, became arteries of culture. Art, theater, and literature spread alongside silver and grain. Sculptors carved gods and men alike in marble that defied time. Temples rose, not just for worship, but for learning, reflection, and civic gathering. Egypt under Ptolemaic rule. Ptolemy ruled with ambition tempered by cunning. He preserved the traditions of the pharaohs while infusing them with Greek thought. Priests and scholars worked alongside Greek administrators. The Nile continued to flood predictably, yet its waters now nourished libraries, academies, and the gardens of Alexandria. Science thrived. Astronomers charted the stars. Physicians studied the human body with a curiosity unmatched in previous ages. Even the common people, while unaware of their place in history, lived in a world where ideas traveled as freely as coins. Seleucid Empire and the East. In Mesopotamia, Seleucus built cities and infrastructure that merged Greek and Persian traditions. Trade flourished along rivers, connecting east and west. Greek artisans painted temples in colors unknown in Macedon. Markets hummed with languages, spices, and fabrics from India to the Mediterranean. Yet power was not without conflict. Wars between diadochi were frequent. Alliances formed and shattered like glass. Yet, in each conquest, in each siege, Greek culture traveled further. Even enemies adopted elements of Hellenism, weaving them into local traditions. The spread of ideas. The Hellenistic period was not merely about conquest. It was about the endurance of ideas. Greek philosophy became a tool for understanding the universe. Stoics taught endurance, the control of emotions, the virtue of rational living. Epicureans debated pleasure, moderation, and the pursuit of tranquility. Mathematics, astronomy, and medicine advanced. Archimedes calculated areas, volumes, and levers. Euclid codified geometry. Physicians documented human anatomy with precision. Ships navigated seas guided by the stars, by knowledge once confined to Athens or Rhodes. Even literature traveled. Poets wrote epics inspired by Homer, now performed for audiences in Babylon, Alexandria, and Antioch. The Iliad and Odyssey, once oral traditions of war and heroism, became texts studied across continents. Myths survived, yet transformed, merging Greek gods with local pantheons, producing hybrids of imagination and belief. The idea of Greece. Greece as a nation had ended. Athens would never again dominate the Mediterranean. Sparta's warriors faded into legend. Yet Greek culture, Greek thought, Greek ideals endured. This was the paradox of the Hellenistic world. The political unity Alexander had forged dissolved almost immediately, but the intellectual and cultural unity he inspired persisted. The idea of Greece traveled further than Alexander's armies ever could. It informed governance, philosophy, art, and science for centuries to come. Even in cities where Macedonian soldiers walked among Persian markets, Greek language, law, and architecture remained. Even in temples where Egyptian gods were worshipped, Greek theater and sculpture left an indelible mark. Greece died as a nation, yet lived as an idea of inquiry, of ambition, of the possibility that a single mortal could reshape the world. Legacy and reflection. By the end of the 4th century BCE, the Hellenistic world was a patchwork of kingdoms, each ruled by a general of Alexander. Borders shifted, kings rose and fell. Wars were fought for land, power, and prestige. Yet through all the chaos, the culture persisted. Libraries held scrolls. Temples taught philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and art flourished. Greek ideas were the mortar binding these kingdoms together. In every corner of the known world, from Alexandria to Antioch, from Babylon to the edge of India, the whispers of Greece persisted. It was a culture built on imagination, ambition, and intellect. It would endure long after kings and soldiers were gone. Even today, centuries later, the Hellenistic legacy remains. Science, mathematics, philosophy, and art all bear the fingerprints of those centuries when Greece lived not as a nation, but as an idea. And it all began with one man, Alexander, whose vision shattered empires and whose influence transcended mortality. In the end, the Hellenistic world was not merely a historical period. It was proof that even when nations fall, ideas endure, that the spirit of a culture, once kindled, can illuminate lands far beyond its origin. And in every library, every temple, every mathematical theorem, and every act of reason, the legacy of Greece lived on, eternal, unbroken, immortal. The mighty city of Rome rose from the hills of Latium, small yet ambitious, its eyes fixed on the horizon. It grew quietly at first, absorbing nearby towns, learning the art of war, the structure of governance, the value of discipline. Generations passed. Rome's legions marched farther, crossed rivers, conquered mountains, and swallowed the lands of its neighbors. And then, inevitably, they came to Greece. The Greek city-states, once masters of philosophy, art, and war, had fractured after centuries of internal strife. Athens, Sparta, and Corinth were shadows of their former glory. Yet Rome, in its ambition, did not merely conquer the land, it encountered the culture. It met Greek thought, Greek art, Greek ideals. Rome's generals stood in Athens and marveled at the Parthenon. Senators read Plato and Aristotle, debating ideas older than the city of Rome itself. Sculptors copied Greek statues, not merely as art, but as lessons in balance, proportion, and the pursuit of perfection. Temples rose echoing Greek columns. The architecture of conquest became the architecture of inspiration. Greek philosophy seeped into Roman life. Stoicism taught Roman leaders the control of emotion, the discipline of duty, the art of reason over impulse. Epicurean thought offered a measured approach to pleasure, the pursuit of tranquility in a world of ambition and conquest. These ideas became the spine of governance, law, and personal conduct. Even as Rome absorbed Greece politically, culturally it became Greek. Greek tutors taught Roman children. Greek texts lined Roman libraries. Greek theater performed in Roman amphitheaters. Rome may have wielded the sword, but Greece wielded the mind. And the legacy extended further. Christianity, born in a world dominated by Rome, carried Greek thought in its veins. The language of philosophy became the language of theology. Plato's and Aristotle's ideas, filtered through Roman and Hellenistic thought, shaped doctrines that would endure for millennia. Greek art, literature, and science became the foundation of the Western world. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy all traced back to the lessons first cultivated in Athens, Alexandria, and the courts of Macedonian kings. Greece as a nation had faded, but its spirit, its ideas, its culture immortal. The contrast was stark. Empires rise and fall. Rome, like Greece, would eventually fracture and fade. Cities would burn, Legions would march no more, yet ideas endure. Art survives beyond palaces. Philosophy survives beyond kingdoms. The human mind, shaped by these legacies, carries them forward. In the streets of modern cities, in libraries, in universities, in places where reason and beauty are pursued, Greece lives. It lives not as a political entity, but as a constellation of thought, achievement, and inspiration. Its influence transcends borders, centuries, and mortality itself. Greece taught the world to question, to reason, to imagine. Rome showed the world how to structure, to govern, to endure. Together, they formed the foundation of Western civilization. One conquered lands, the other conquered minds, and in that conquest of thought, Greece triumphed eternally. Even as empires crumble into dust, ideas remain. They shape generations, inspire revolutions, and light the way for those who seek knowledge. Greece may have fallen, but its essence is immortal. Ideas do not die. They endure. They echo in every mind willing to listen. The story of Greece ends not with the fall of Athens or the conquest by Rome. It ends with the persistence of its spirit, the immortality of its vision, and the enduring brilliance of its ideas.